Good morning, everyone. We'll just wait a couple of minutes for more people to join the discussion, and we will get started very soon. Okay, it's 8:01, so maybe we can get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us at this early time today and for starting your day and your week with us. So before we get started with what you are here to see for today, let me just share the agenda. Okay, so first we will just have for 1 or 2 minutes. I will just briefly remind or introduce for some of you what APACMed is and what we do. Then our speaker and moderator, Stephen Sunderland from L.E.K Consulting, will be taking you through the findings and recommendations from our newly published paper. We will have then 30 minutes to hear from our panel of experts and answer some of the questions you would have. So I will just present our experts today. So we're really happy to have with us Richard Vines, Chair and Chief Executive at Rare Cancer in Australia, Dr. Deputy Oncology, Dr. Amol Simmer, Head of Medical Affairs Asia Pacific and Japan at Illumina, and Dr. Suyok Jain, Associate Director, Medical Affairs, Guardant Health. We will finish the presentation with the project. Okay, so just a few words about APACMed. So APACMed is the only regional trade association that represents the medical device and IVD companies in Asia Pacific. So basically, we aim to connect the different stakeholders working in our industry together and be this neutral platform between the companies and the government, for instance. This will allow us to promote innovation and impact the different policies that advances healthcare in our region. So we count around 230 members at APACMed. So they range from startups and SMEs to bigger MNCs. And we have a different group that we call committees. Each committee will have a specific focus. So you can see some committees on the right side of the slides. And what is important to note today is that our association will be opening a dedicated work stream for in vitro diagnostics in 2023. And this will allow us to put more emphasis on this important topic. So by allocating more resources, more time, more manpower as well, to drive projects that are really specific to diagnostics. So please do reach out to us if you would like to collaborate with us on this topic. And yeah, without further ado, I will now hand over to Stephen Sunderland, our first speaker for this session. So I mentioned Stephen is a partner at L.E.K Consulting, and he will be taking you through the findings and recommendations from our paper. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Cindy. Can you hear me okay? Super. Okay. Never quite sure with the technology first thing on a Monday. Well, thank you everybody for making it into Zoom so early during World Cup season. We're talking today about NGS and the paper that is now available to all members and indeed beyond via APACMed's website, and is in the process of translating into several other languages as well. What we wanted to do with this, the next 15-20 minutes or so, is just hit some of the headlines in the paper so that those of you who've not stepped into that in detail yet or weren't involved directly in the development and publication of that, understand the broad shape of that. And then we'll move into what you're most interested in, which will be the discussion around that and around some of the themes of that paper with the industry leaders that Cindy just introduced a moment ago from our own region. Cindy, could I ask you to page forward? Thank you. This paper was sponsored. Clearly, APACMed was the organizer and the main publisher of that in their capacity as the leading organization for medtech in the region. It was co-sponsored by a number of NGS working group members shown on the page here. So Guardant, Illumina, J&J, Roche, Thermo Fisher, and Vazyme were all involved in the development and the contribution to the paper. L.E.K held the pen and ran key parts of the process as we went through that process. And really, the idea here was to address the fact that there's quite a lot of complexity in bringing NGS to market across a heterogeneous region such as APAC. And there is today quite a variety of mechanisms and issues in doing that. But first and foremost, these working group members in APACMed believe that it's important that there is a quality baseline essentially in the market, and wanted to explore that with an independent set of KOLs and other stakeholders within the region. Next page, please, Cindy. So the goal here, the overall goal, was to try to create really a baseline, a white paper, which was could be used to try and reinforce influencing strategies for effective and market appropriate national policy when it came to the implementation of and the regulation of NGS, particularly with regard to the quality NGS. So not so much focusing right now on reimbursement and other areas of regulation and policy, but mainly around just ensuring quality. So there's a number of routes into that, but one of the ways that we, or some of the specific objectives of this publication were to try and articulate the why, essentially. So why do we care about quality NGS, both from a sort of rational sort of statistical point of view, but also from the point of view of understanding where there have been things which have gone wrong in the past, provide some tangible guidance to potential audiences, particularly public policymakers, around how NGS can and should be regulated, with reference to other, both jurisdictions within the region, but also other regions as well, and provide some guidance and recommendations for how that could be translated into something that was effective in pretty much all of the different jurisdictions which comprise APAC today. Next page, please, Cindy. The route into that, clearly there's, I'm sure many of the people on the call today would have a lot of opinions around those issues. We set this up as a program of work with 2 key roundtable sessions involving 22 regional and global NGS experts. The first of those roundtables focused on the why, essentially. So why is it important to have quality in an NGS test for clinical use, into that session we had, of course, the sort of important prescribing stakeholders, so medical oncologists. We also had patient groups. We also had a couple of industry representatives, a policymaker, and a global expert on NGS related policy issues. We then transitioned with that in hand to take it essentially for granted that this is an important topic, and then move on to roundtable 2, which is more about the what and the how. So let's assume that we believe that this is important. Well, what is it that we would want to try and guide providers of NGS tests on, and how would that be implemented? So how would they go about, how would policymakers in particular go about thinking about regulation of the industry? For that, we got into the technical side of the business more so than the clinical side, and spoke to pathologists, geneticists, and those involved in the industry as well. Thanks, Cindy. Just in terms of scoping here, we were simultaneously broad and narrow depending on what you were thinking about. So the key point when reading this work or thinking about the implications of it is that to remember that this is grounded purely in oncology. So there's clearly a lot of other applications of NGS across the healthcare spectrum, but what we were focused really on here was oncology. But effectively every potential test use, so every potential use of NGS and every potential test type, from a single biomarker, for which clearly that's a pretty narrow application, all the way through hotspots, CGP, whole genome sequencing, and so forth. In practice, a lot of the recommendations here and a lot of the conversation focused on the second and third of those test types, so hotspot panels and CGP, just simply because those are probably the first and foremost uses of NGS for oncology today. And therefore what our panelists felt most comfortable offering opinions on, essentially, as to how that should work or how that could work. Thank you, Cindy. So the white paper itself came to market. It's been available through APACMed for a few weeks now, since the forum, which was effectively simultaneous with the publication of the paper. Within that, as well as the boilerplate which you'd expect, there were really five main topics that we were covering within that align pretty well to the intention of the objectives that we were trying to fulfill. So first was an outline of the value of that, value of next-gen sequencing. The second was really an exposition of some of the best practices that we've seen and heard about through the roundtables and follow-ups to the roundtables, with regard to guidelines and references, essentially, for policymakers around next-gen sequencing. The third was to lay out the challenges specific to NGS in the APAC region, and hence the recommendations associated with addressing some of those challenges, as well as the broader quality considerations and initiatives that we've seen in the region and globally to try and address some of the quality concerns and enhance quality around all of that. We'll double click on a couple of those areas as part of the next couple of minutes of conversation, and then we'll also come back to those as part of a panel. Clearly, I think if you didn't believe NGS was adding value and wasn't important, you probably wouldn't be on the call this morning, so we probably will spend a little less time on that today. But importantly, we need to shape and share with you the recommendations. Next, please, Cindy. Thank you. So apologies, that has come through a little bit small on at least on my laptop screen anyway. So there's really 5 areas of best practice that we laid out within the report, with examples from all over, essentially. So those 5 areas were relating to essentially quality guidelines for the tests themselves. Key topics within that we double click on within the main body of the report would be analytical validity, clinical validity, and clinical utility. Those are really the key parts of that story. And clearly work is ongoing around all of those for all of the tests that are coming to market from major vendors today. The second area was around the regulation and essentially guidelines for data analysis and interpretation. So key areas of discussion here were around essentially the process, the use of trained and qualified professionals for that, as well as the software itself that was being used for analysis and reporting. The third area was around data reporting standards. So how that gets done, the approach, the relaying of variants detected and non-deterrence, and the limitations of that. I think that the key thing that we'll come back to in due course on this topic is that there is some variation around that, both within the region between different providers of tests, within the region between different jurisdictions, and between regions as well, actually. And because today the landscape of testing is really quite fragmented, that variation in all the different reporting makes it quite complicated for the prescribing oncologists to interpret, and therefore also limits. Clearly, complexity is challenging in any environment, particularly so in what is already a challenging environment in treating of cancers. So we have some specific recommendations around reporting standards as well. We are also take a look around the clinical guidelines for usage. So where to use NGS, even right down to test and specific test and instrument usage, sample collection, and indeed the interpretation of tests as part of that. And then finally, quality standards for and guidelines for laboratories themselves, where again, there is quite a patchwork across the region, across the APAC region, from effectively unregulated all the way through to national regulations, which only apply or effectively constrain supply of NGS testing to domestic providers or providers who are present in markets, through to close to global standards, which are gold standards. So each one of those areas is relevant as policymakers come to market or try to regulate the NGS industry as it stands up and develops rapidly within the region. Cindy, next page, if you would. Thank you. There's a few complications to what we were doing in terms of trying to formulate recommendations across those different areas and prioritize recommendations across those different areas within the APAC region. First and foremost, you hear it a lot on calls like these, but there is clearly a huge range in terms of both regulatory capacity, but also clinical capacity and resource availability between markets such as Australia, Japan, and Korea at one end of the spectrum, and truly developing countries, developing nations at the other end of the spectrum within Asia. Finding a single set of recommendations that could be useful and directionally correct across all of that is clearly a challenge in that context. The second is that whereas usually or oftentimes when we're talking about regulation of product of clinical diagnostics, we're often really talking about IVD regulation, so product approval. In this case, we've got with NGS in APAC, an awful lot of today's testing is done on an LDT basis. So lab developed test basis or research tests. That means that there's effectively a different mix and a different dynamic from what we see in typical diagnostic work and typical policy influence work across the region. And then thirdly, that therefore, because of that mix, essentially the laboratory regulation is even more important than it would normally be. because the labs themselves are either self-regulating or under a series of quality standards to try and produce sort of quality results. So the clinical guidance that comes back, the diagnostics guidance that comes back, is very dependent on really how good the lab is, not just how good the test is. Next page, please, Cindy. The other complication which we worked through with our roundtable participants and needed to try and find a way through was that because of all that variation through markets in APAC, not least around reimbursement, but also around affordability, so income levels and ability to pay. What works as a gold standard actually risks, it was a recognition that if you apply a gold standard on quality across the whole of the region, it risks actually damaging the progress of NGS and the availability of NGS across for patients and for clinicians across the region, because you inject cost, you restrict access, you restrict the number of labs that can possibly serve, and therefore potentially people who might otherwise benefit from NGS cannot. So we needed to try and strike a balance, and roundtable participants effectively agreed on, and a consensus view was that there should be a certain minimum quality that is that should be achievable through all markets, but it doesn't have to be the same level, and it doesn't have to be a global gold standard in every market in order for NGS to be useful. What it does need is this certain minimum standard, quote unquote, which can support trust building essentially. So the last thing that anybody wants to do is to have labs or tests in the market which don't do what you think they're doing from a clinical perspective, and therefore undermine trust in NGS as a modality, as a way of testing or a complementary diagnostic for oncology, and therefore setting the whole program, setting whole adoption, setting the industry back by years potentially to recover from that trust problem. So you need a certain minimum level, was the concept, in order to be able to support moving forward. Thank you, Cindy. So we had off the back of this work and off the back of the roundtables a number of different recommendations. We have effectively tiered those into two tiers. So tier 1 recommendations are on the screen in front of you, as well as being pretty expansively set out in the main report. There are also tier 2 recommendations as well, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But you'll see that these align pretty well to the best practices and the key challenges that exist in the market today in APAC. The first is that we believe that regulators need to produce guidelines for the standardization and quality of NGS across the whole of the workflow. So not just the specific product, the test itself, but also how that gets administered, how biopsies are taken, how those get handled and processed through the workflow, such that you know, as a clinician, as a medical oncologist, getting the results back, exactly what it is that you're getting, and have a reasonable confidence to use that, both prescribe that test in the first place and what might be a reasonably costly test in the overall therapeutic program, but also confidence in the results when they come back, that they are what you think they are. The second recommendation relates to enforcement of laboratory accreditation and certification. So most markets across the region have a level of this, but the important thing here is that those guidelines certainly exist, but also that they are enforced, and that they make sense for the purposes of using NGS for oncology, as we've described here. Again, this is an area of some debate. So we were not specific in this case of whether labs should aspire or regulators should aspire to push the whole market up essentially to clear standards. That might not be appropriate here for reasons of access and affordability, but at least having standards that are clear and transparent and reliable and reliably inspected and enforced is important. And then thirdly, restricting, possibly counterintuitively, restricting use of NGS was also considered important, so that you didn't end up again with NGS being prescribed for areas of therapy or investigation that were not considered clinically useful. So making sure that there are some clear clinical guidelines on where to use, where not to use for oncology is important, was considered important. That clearly exists in some cancers and in some jurisdictions, but not in all cancers in all jurisdictions in the region today. Thank you, Cindy. The tier 2 recommendations we highlight here, slightly less, somewhat less deep dived within the main body of the report, but also you'll see the linkages to some of the challenges and best practices that we've highlighted elsewhere. A couple of these relate to sort of downstream effects. So, for example, aligning on reporting terminology. So, for example, specific biomarkers should have consistent naming across different reports, so that you end up, so again, you simplify the work of medical oncologists in terms of interpreting that. Improving readability, so having a clear sort of 1 to 2 page readout rather than a 7-page dump is pretty important. We also recommend here on making sure that clinicians are clear on their understanding of when tests are useful and where they should be used and why they should be used. That's as much as anything clearly that you can go to guidelines for that, but actually people need to educate and raise awareness around those issues, which ultimately generally falls to industry to do that. Finally, some evidence building and important research tasks that are relevant here. So ultimately, the project, the adoption requires confidence that these tests work in local populations across Asia. So making sure that evidence is published, that there is a consistent stream of new data coming to market, and ultimately that there is validity, so validation of the applicability of these tests in local gene pools is really important, given that much of the research and validation work today has been done on essentially on Caucasian Western European populations. Thank you, Cindy. Probably just one parting thought before we move to the panel as well is that we were unashamedly focused on quality for this phase of work. We believe, and the working group members believe, that quality is at the core of all of this, and if you can't be confident of how that is, how your tests are delivering in the market, is very unlikely that you can get anywhere with anything else. But that being said, there are a range of other things, a range of other areas which, some of which require regulatory input and regulatory discussions to move forward. Not least at the top of the page here around coverage and reimbursement. Affordability is an issue for NGS, as is just general infrastructure and education and awareness. So making sure that there is continuing progress, or trying to deliver on continuing progress across lots of different areas of the agenda, as well as quality, will be needed in order to move the debate forward, move the industry forward within the region. but you're going to need quality as the first step in all of that. So if just as a quick recap, in terms of where we think we are today, there's really 3 key takeaways to remember. One is that the white paper exists. So there is a body, a publicly available body of evidence, basically, which is referenceable, has credible independent sources, and some aligned talking points that are relevant for, we think, anybody in the industry to take to policymakers. We think that there are the 3 areas that we should consistently, as an industry group, continue to try and push with policymakers, because we believe that they are the biggest ticket, essentially the biggest ticket items that will unlock value for patients and clinicians going forward. That is, 1, guidelines around the standardization of the workflow for NGS, 2, laboratory accreditation and certification, and 3, guidelines for routine use. And then number 3, just to remember that there are some other areas that beyond quality need to be considered in terms of driving wider adoption and the realization of the value that NGS can bring to patients and clinicians. Clearly, affordability and reimbursement is one of those areas, but there are a number of others as well, many of which will need to be led by industry. I think I'll pause there. You've heard quite enough from me this morning. And we'll turn to our panel. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining this morning. Maybe if I could ask you to pop your video on. I know Cindy has already introduced you, so I won't reintroduce. But maybe if I could just start with a relatively simple question, which is, why do we really care about quality in your view? Clearly, the report lays out some of this, but we haven't talked about that huge amount as part of the recap this morning. And maybe Suyog, can we come to you first on why does quality matter?
Absolutely. Stephen, thank you very much, first of all, for summarizing the very comprehensive paper in such a lucid manner. Thank you very much. So from quality, I think, has 2 clear aspects. One is what we can easily measure in terms of number or quantify in what happens in the laboratory about sensitivity, specificity, and all other parameters. At the same time, as a physician, what I'm more concerned is what happens to the patient. What is the impact on the patient for the quality? And we have seen examples like Theranos exist and they are publicly available. What can happen if things go unregulated? Quality ultimately impacts the patients. But if I take an example of the area where I closely work in, NSCLC patients, all the NSCLC patients should undergo sequencing for at least 7 or 8 biomarkers, where FDA-approved drug exists today. If the laboratory to which the physician has sent the sample is not doing its job well, or there are some quality concerns, it is possible that a false positive report may be provided, which means patient may be treated with a drug which was not required for that patient, or a false negative report may be provided, which means even if the patient could have been treated with an actionable, more convenient and safe drug, they are being put on chemotherapy, which is not going to be that effective in that patient, maybe have more side effects, and ultimately leading to suboptimal outcomes. And also that will not help physicians actually evaluate the drug's efficacy in the real life situation. So quality does have components across the entire spectrum. And then I'm happy, I think in this paper, we could summarize some of the clear recommendations about quality. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Suyog. You conveniently put patients at the core of that, and patient outcomes and efficacy of treatment for patients in all of that. Richard, can you build on any of Suyog's themes or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Agree?
And I think Suyog's done a great job. But I would just add two things. One is that we have to have good quality, because sometimes we do not have an infinite amount of tissue to analyze, and therefore it's important that we get it right the first time, and it's important that we get it right quickly. You know, it's no good, you know, with something as aggressive as non-small cell lung cancer. You know, you do not want to be hanging around for a month to wait for test results and then to find that you didn't have enough, you know, analyzable tissue, and you know, it's just all got to be slick and quick. And I think, and all of that goes to quality. And I think the other thing, my background prior to all of this was in software. So I think one of the things that stood out to me in the report was the absolute necessity to make sure that we have good software control on the software we're using to do some of this analysis, because you know, we all know from our iPhone how quick it is for a piece of software to get out of date and become irrelevant. So yeah, it's really about that speed, the accuracy, the respect for the tissue. All of those things should be embedded in any quality control mechanism.
Thanks, Richard. I think the point around time and tissue is a really important one in this case. So not wasting the time that we do have for patients, and not wasting the tissue that we are able to glean, because sometimes those biopsies can be very difficult and traumatic in their own right. Maybe Saidi, can I come to you next about essentially the report? So figuring out, we had a couple of recommendations in there about reporting clarity, reporting consistency, and just how that's used in practice. Can you expand on that? How do we make sure that our reports are being used for what we think they should be used for?
Okay. Thanks, Stephen. I'm actually very impressed with your presentation just now. It's very good, and I think if we have that standardized throughout APAC country, it would be very helpful. So actually, in terms of how to ensure a good report, so in practice in our lab, so actually we include all the information like clinical information, and also clinical history of the patient, where the patient, you really need to, before you're reporting, you really need to understand patient are already have a previous treatment, or what the clinician want to find. For example, is resistant, or this is a newly diagnosis. So this information need to be available in the report, so that we can clearly put what is the recommended, means that when we found any abnormalities or any variants that we found that associated with resistance, or what is the treatment of option. So all these need to be clearly stated in the report. So we don't have, we don't want that any discrepancy, discrepancy between the lab reports and also the clinical report. So the other thing is importance. I think we should also mention about the guidelines that what you are following. So for example, like is FDA approved based on the treatment, or even a clinical trial, or even from ESCO or from ESMO. All this information also, it would be helpful for the patient, especially when we means that use this report in medical tumor board meeting. So this is very helpful. So I think the standardization of report among I think across the APAC, it will be very helpful, because you know this report sometimes they will go for clinical trial. So if the report will be standardized, it will be helpful to other means like the principal investigator to find a good candidate of patient to enroll in the clinical trial. And yeah, I think that would be the best strategy to standardize the report. So that is actually the practice in our lab, to ensure the report can be interpreted throughout all specialties. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good and an interesting point, Edie. And we're not just talking about, in this case, reports for clinical use. Essentially, we're also talking about reports for clinical trial enrollment, clinical trial tracking potentially as well. Suyog, do you have anything to build on that?
Yes, I thank you, Saidi, for summarizing it so well. I just have two specific things. One, each laboratory under the LDT may be doing things slightly differently compared to the other labs. And that's where, first of all, for the lab to put out some sort of performance matrix which is their own experience about what's the sensitivity or specificity they expect at that particular sample threshold, what is their minimum sample requirement, and in case that particular sample was lower than their expected minimum samples, do they still expect the same sensitivity specificity? I think this sort of nuances are also crucial for physicians to make that sort of decision whether to really trust on that report or again validate it somewhere else. So this is a topic we believe we already have tried to address in the tier 2 recommendations in the paper. And of course, we could build on that further.
Cool. Thank you, Suyog. Maybe just a quick reminder to the audience actually that we have a Q&A function here. Please do use that. If we get a couple of minutes at the end, we can certainly ask our panelists anything that's burning on your agenda. And I see one question in there already. So I
think Amal has a comment on one of the questions too.
Yeah, I think Amal, do you want to comment now or come back to you later on?
No, maybe later on. Yeah,
sure. I guess so just to continue with you for a moment, how do you see the trade-off between effectively lab developed tests and how do they become credible for clinical use? Clearly in some markets LDTs are actually not that well established as a general principle, or not that well trusted. How do you think that works through for NGS in APAC?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I think it is an important question. Compared to the differences in the quality for simpler tests like hemoglobin or blood count, there could be a lot of variations across the lab. When we talk about NGS for cancer patients, I think we should not even use the word trade-off because this is just a point of no compromise here. So we realize, especially in Asia Pacific, we cannot shy away from LDTs. They will have to be there to help really propagate this space of NGS rapidly. At the same time, it's not just anecdotal evidence or some people speaking about it. It's a well-established fact that if the same sample is sent to different laboratories who are performing LDTs in their own way, there may be differences in the way they report out, or they find out the mutations or miss out the reports, find out the mutations. And therefore, there is definitely need for individual laboratories to do some sort of internal validation, and they may not be able to do it alone. They will have to definitely work with the manufacturers, which are very few in this case. Work with manufacturers, work yourself, as well as a local pathological accreditation body to have some sort of minimum standards and publish it so that physicians are able to refer it whenever they are in doubt or wherever they need to validate. And even if we have tried to address this topic in the paper, that if we try to keep the bar too high, it will just hamper the growth of this NGS space. But I'm particularly impressed with the VALID Act, which is under consideration in the US Congress, where they are allowing this standardization of all the LDTs, but not stopping them from doing the patient reporting for now. They were giving them some time to continuously improve internally, and then eventually everybody achieve the same standard. I think that sort of approach could be good in our region too.
Sure. Yeah, clearly we always have this tension in looking cross-regionally around initiatives or regulations that's been developed in other areas. It's some of the regulators are rightly, not necessarily skeptical, but rightly concerned about the implications locally for different markets as those come through. But yeah, certainly the US for a lot of NGS technologies and regulation is a step or two ahead of where we are today in APAC. Perhaps Saidi, could we come to you for a moment and talk about the evolution of effectively biomarker testing more generally? So we're moving from a paradigm which might be small panel tests or small hotspot tests through into CGP and more sophisticated and more comprehensive tests. How do you see that evolution? So how fast is that going to move? What are the implications for how we think about quality and the evolution of the regulations that we need to have confidence in quality?
Okay, thanks. That's this very good question, because I can say that in my country itself, Malaysia, so we can see that the acceptance of the big panel of comprehensive genomic profiling is being adopted in certain labs. So we can see that there's a good need to use that platform because of the clinical relevant genomic alteration. It can be done in one way. So the good thing is because we can save a lot of tissue. So if you are using a single testing, you need to, like, for example, PCR, you need like 3 tissue, and then using FISH, you might need like 5 tissue. IAC, you need 8 tissue. So with usage of NGS, it saves you in terms of that, and the quality become like standardized between inside each platform. So I think the key important thing is actually the validation. So in our lab, the validation across all platforms need to be done before the usage of NGS itself for the clinicals. So we have done a lot of validation, a lot of comparison between I can say it's not just between the lab, but we do have a lot of quality assurance programs. For example, we have CAP. We enroll in an external quality molecular network from EMQ and from UK. So we have a lot of quality assurance in our lab to make sure that the results and the quality of the result is good. Sometimes, even though we have a new method like tumor mutational burden, so it's good thing because now CAP already have the TMB as one of the quality program in their program. So it's good, and we also need to to enforce a lot of lab to go for the accreditation. So then we can standardize a lot of a big panel. Then a lot of improvement, a lot of discussion, and there will be a lot of good to make sure all the lab that have a standardized quality. Yeah.
Thank you, Saidi. Amol, your firm is at the bleeding edge of this. What's your view on what needs to change for CGP and other more sophisticated tests to be effective in the market?
So yes, Stephen. So you really raise a very important point. What is the clinical utility of the CGP? And I'm talking more from the clinical perspective. So I just came back from ESMO this weekend, and the conference was amazing. And if you look at the number of targeted therapies which are coming into the market, it's just growing. Few cancers were in the past, we didn't have much of targetable mutations. We have therapies coming in. We have therapies or mutations which are now targetable. So what it says that the clinical utility of the CGP is definitely huge, because we have to get things right at the first go. At one end, we do have therapeutics which are coming in, but of course, it's going to be costly. So we don't have luxury to really try and keep trying. And trial of error approach is no longer valid. So we have to get it right at the first go. When it's come to CGP compared to small panels or medium panels, the CGP definitely provides more clinical information, not only about the targetable mutations, but about the resistance associated mutations as well. So you can make a right decision for the treatment selection. Also, the pan-tumor biomarkers such as TMB, MSI, and now we have the HRD, which is evolving. So you can make a right decision for the treatment, even you don't have a targeted mutations in given patient. In terms of the clinical utility, the CGP has more value compared to small panels, the medium panels. But the question, how do we drive that adoption? So what Saidi mentioned in terms of the the quality standards and the lab which are able to do it in the right way, we have to drive a lot of education among clinicians as well, so they understand the value of the CGP at forefront. And of course, you mentioned in presentation the reimbursement. So how do we convince payers to really reimburse CGP at an earlier stage? So these are a few thoughts about CGP, but to summarize, it definitely has a huge clinical utility, and we need to really work to drive that adoption in the market.
Amol, you raise a very important point around effectively the access to these tests and the affordability of them. And that, I think, our question from the audience, there's one in there around essentially how do we persuade payers to come to this. Where do you think is the appropriate balance in here, and how do we get to that balance?
So in my opinion, the access is a very complex issue. It's not about just showing up to the payers and saying, hey, you need to reimburse this test. So if you look at how do we ensure the maximum appropriate use or the access of the therapies, there are a few challenges. And broadly, I could think, maybe among, those important challenges, one is the overall NGS policy environment and the existing infrastructure. Because if you look across APAC, we still have a very limited infrastructure, especially, lack of trained qualified personnels, such as bioinformaticians. Right, so there are lack of some national level healthcare strategies, maybe national cancer genomic strategy, which can really drive policy level decision making. So we need to address that as well at a bigger level. Other thing is public funding and the healthcare technology assessment. Across the region, we see that the current, the health technology assessment processes, they are not unable to fully assess the value of NGS. In some countries, the STA framework don't exist. There is a lack of dedicated funding as well, or if the funding is available, it is very restricted. And lastly, the stakeholder engagement and awareness. So when I say stakeholders, policymakers, regulators, SCP patients, and not all are on the same page in terms of understanding the value of the NGS. So with the challenges, how do we navigate to make sure that we get an appropriate access? One is how we can increase the awareness and understanding of the value of NGS to these key stakeholders. And that will take kind of, the efforts from all the fronts, and we need to really come together and do it. Although the specific of, the reimbursement challenges for the NGS may vary from region to region or country to country. But if we really want to change the access paradigm, we need all the stakeholders, payers, policymakers, patients, caregivers, and the manufacturers of diagnostic and the therapeutics to work together. Then only it is possible. Especially for the diagnostics and the pharmaceutical industry, they need to start dialogue with the payer and STA bodies to arrive at clear and broadly applied consensus that how much evidence is needed, what kind of evidence is needed to really allow the market access, for NGS technology to benefit the patients. So it's a broader challenge, it's a multifaceted challenge, and all the stakeholders really need to work together to address those. It's not only the diagnostic or the pharmaceuticals or the patient advocacy, but we really have to work together to address this challenge.
Thank you, Amol. Siog, you're also bringing product to market in APAC. Do you have anything to reinforce in there? What do you think works?
Yes, so I think more than as a company representative bringing products to market, I'm happy to participate as a physician. So I'm completely aligned with what Dr. Amol just shared. Very clear, actionable items there. one more thing we notice now when we are working with some governments is that some sort of cost effectiveness model analysis, they already exist in most of the developed markets for pharmaceutical drugs. However, when it comes to the diagnostic test, evaluating the cost effectiveness is not going to be easy. However, this sort of mathematical models still exist and utilized for the reimbursement discussions in US and Europe and in Canada. And therefore, if we work along with the local health authorities, the local manufacturer or companies like Guardant in a very customized manner with each individual country to have some sort of cost effectiveness analysis, that may really help move the needle quickly, at least to the private insurance companies first, and then eventually the larger government insurance schemes would come into the play. Thank you.
Thanks, Vio. I'm conscious we're coming up on time. Maybe just we spent a lot of time on quality and a little bit of time on the very important topic of reimbursement and affordability. Perhaps I could come back to you, Amal and CD, on what else maybe what else is going to be important as we think about driving forward adoption of NGS, and particularly I guess the more sophisticated tests within that.
So right, Steve. So you see, you mentioned, apart from quality, there are a lot of other barriers for adoption of this technology. When we look at the technology is fantastic, it's there. But how do we bring that technology into the clinic? How do we drive the clinical value of that technology for the better patient outcome? That's the question. And when we look broadly, in terms of the barriers for adoption, the awareness and education among different stakeholders, which I already highlighted, right? So if the clinicians, the patients are not aware about the availability of the biomarker, if they don't know about the referral pathways, particularly in the rural areas of few of the countries, then the clinical utilization in NGS is going to be challenged. Other thing is, if physicians, if they don't have appropriate knowledge, so they will definitely have a lot of uncertainty in terms of how to interpret the genomic results and the guide treatment. So there is a huge need in terms of awareness and education. Second, we spoke about a lot of quality standardization in the lab perspective, but the clinical standardization, because if you look at the clinical practice now, most of the clinicians, there's a lot of variation in terms of the pattern of ordering the test in different countries. For the same cancer, people are ordering the gene panel, which consists of 2 genes versus 10 genes and 30 genes. So there is a lot of heterogeneity, and that is primarily being driven by lack of validation and lack of standardization of in-house biomarkers, which we have addressed in this presentation and the discussion today. Other thing specifically for the APAC is infrastructure. There's a lack of ability of the physical access to the test and the qualified personnel, especially bioinformaticians and lab technicians, so on and so forth. There's a limited knowledge and capacity to really how do we interpret the result based upon analysis, and those capabilities need to be developed. One of the important which I just spoke about is reimbursement and lack of value assessment processes and the frameworks for the diagnostics in our region. And the absence of this widely accepted STA frameworks, which can demonstrate the value of NGS. So that is again crucial. One of the things which I realized, there's so much heterogeneity in our region, and the timing to access is an issue as well. Because if you look at some countries, you can use NGS or the CGP in advanced stage and not in early stage. So we need to work on the time to access, and how do we convince the payers to really have kind of reimbursement so that the NGS or the CGP is used at the appropriate time. And lastly, but another very important is access to targeted therapies. You may have a test, but if you don't have access to targeted therapies, either commercially or under compassionate access or in clinical trial, then there's going to be challenge in terms of adoption of NGS tests as well. So how do we address that quickly? Of course, engagement, education from all fronts, evidence generation in terms of how we demonstrate the utility, both at a baseline and at a tumor progression level, so that we can support those policy level discussion and reimbursement discussion. How do we influence the clinical guidelines and the clinical management? And one of the specific, the pragmatic thing is the having molecular tumor boards, because not all the oncologists are at the same level in terms of their understanding and interpretation of NGS data. So how do we support and kind of, the average oncologist in terms of interpretation of NGS results and help them to transition those results into the clinical action, which can benefit patients. So very briefly, these are a few things. It's a broader topic. We can talk about in hours about, the barriers and challenges for the NGS adoption. But briefly, these are a few things I think, which are needed to be addressed.
Thank you, Dr. Amal. Maybe, but just before we come to CED, I know we've just lost Richard, and we're going slightly over time here. I think we'll just take another moment or two. Oh. I know Richard also wanted to flag that in terms of wider adoption of NGS, there was an issue around data ownership as a potential barrier to progress in there as well. So resolving, creating clarity around that and creating pathways to either data sharing or navigating national data privacy and data sovereignty issues is also important. Maybe if I can ask you, CED, to close for us before handing to Cindy. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to Amal's comments around barriers to progress here as an operator for lab yourself?
Yeah, sure. So actually, it's good. Like Dr. Amal mentioned just now. So it's actually all about NGS. It's about awareness. I think I can see it from Malaysia about awareness about the adoption and about the affordability. So these three is very an important issue in implementing NGS in I can say from my country or also from the others also. But most of it is actually cost. But if you can see from the wide range, is actually Malaysia, I think always somehow means that receive a lot of like FDA, means that FDA drug registered in Malaysia. So the means that the drug accepted, not the drug registration, is quite somehow late because of the data. So you need to go through, but to show that how important NGS with all this information and information like means the prevalence of every mutation in Malaysia, and then can it fast forward, means that it can bring it fast, the drug registered in Malaysia with some addition of clinical trials. So this is very important actually in means like in certain country, that to bring the drug accessibility in Malaysia, and other countries. So that's why we are actually create a lot of awareness of using NGS in clinical practice to make sure that the drug accessibility means that is in the country itself to get very means that to get access to all the patient in the in the country. And the other thing I want to add about the role of pharma and insurance companies in Malaysia. So actually, because of the NGS, so we can means that group all this or we call it as a joint collaboration, public-private partnership, everything to work together to means that to invest or even to support of the NGS testing itself. So some of them like means like give a co-sponsor, or some of them give a fully sponsor. So it makes the NGS cost is very affordable to patient, and somehow it can be free, but it depends on each country. But for Malaysia, I can see that some of the pharma actually they are even want to sponsor. Like now, I think we just came back came back from the ESMO Asia. BRCA1, BRCA2, BRCA1 and BRCA2 already approved in means like we need to do especially in triple negative breast cancer as early means that early detection. So we need to do a BRCA from the early rather than the late stage, so the treatment can be done means like the treatment and also the plan of patient management is good. But I also because of a short period of time, I also want to include The real challenges is we really need to work together with the clinician, like a from surgeon. So the importance of to make sure the quality of tissue. So they need to do means like after surgery, the ischemic time to get a better quality, and from the lab time, the paraffin embedded tissue, how long you need to fix everything, we need to be standardized, because this will affect of all and our NGS testing results. So it's very important, because I can see when we in Malaysia as means that we have experienced a lot of difficulty of getting a good quality result from prostate cancer, from the tissue from the prostate. A lot of failure when we run in NGS. So I think this is one of the criteria we should add in as to make sure that both lab and also both surgeon know about the quality. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. We come back to biopsy. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sidi. Great way to close. And thank you to Amol, Sidi, and Siog, and of course Richard, who's had to go already, for your thoughts and sharing this morning. Cindy, I think you're going to tell us about where APACMed is going next.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for your insights to all our speakers. It was a really interesting session, and we're still learning from you. So thanks very much. Just with all the recommendations we heard from you, there are two things that we will be working on at APACMed mainly next year. The first one, I heard a lot about the increase in awareness and education. So this we will be going to the different stakeholders in our industry and working on AGS. We will really bring this paper to the different countries, to the governments, and work with the different stakeholders. And also on affordability. So next year we are planning to work on a paper dedicated to this specific topic. So all of you present on the call, if you want to join us in these two initiatives, share the paper as broadly as possible, because the more stakeholders are working with us, the more powerful our voice will be when we will go to the government and again all the other stakeholders. So the paper is available. We're working on translating our paper, Steve mentioned, in different languages, and an infographic summarizing the paper is also available to share it a bit more easily with your stakeholders. So yes, again, feel free to join us if you're interested to bring this topic forward, and then to work closely with governments with us next year. And yeah, thank you all for your time today. Thank you for insight. Thank you, Steve, for the great moderation and presentation. And I'll see you soon. Thank you, everyone.